So good afternoon. This is the PA-502 Delaware County Continuum of Care FY 2026 Continuum of Care Competition information session. My name is Jason Alexander. I am the consultant to the PA-502 Continuum of Care, and we're going to begin with opening remarks from Chris Welsh. Chris is the interim chief of Social Services and Community Programs in the Delaware County Department of Human Services. Chris?
Yes, thank you, Jason. Good afternoon, everybody. I won't say the long title again, but I am relatively new to this role. I was the county's public defender from July of 2020 until February of this year. Um, First thing that I wanted to start by saying is that I think most of you are probably aware, but Jessica Fink, after serving the county for over 20 years, and at least the last 10 of which I think in the role of adult and family services, retired relatively recently. Um, we have just recently hired a new person to fill a more sort of a higher level role in housing at the county. That position will be filled in August by Phyllis Chamberlain, who is the current executive director of the Pennsylvania Housing Alliance. So we're excited to be bringing Phyllis on board. Once Phyllis is on board, we'll be posting Jess's position and then also, accepting applications and trying to fill that. So appreciate the patience that folks can have with us during this time of transition. And we're excited about the future, but as obviously when people leave and you're onboarding new people, there is a little bit of a rough patch with that period of transition. Also, just wanted to briefly say thank you for coming to this information session. As most of you are probably aware, there are some significant changes to the continuum of care NOFO this year. And it's very important that all of the agencies that receive funding have applied for and have received funding prior years understand what those changes are, and then make your submission to us this year for the grant this year with a full awareness of what those changes are and what the new priorities for HUD are this year. Um, as you all know, the CoC has a governing board. There's a small subset of that governing board that I think is called the scoring committee. The scoring committee will be scoring the applications that all of you put in. And this is that scoring committee has a bigger challenge this year than in years past because of the significant changes and because in years past, we have been able to put in, I'm going to get the tiers wrong, but the protected tier, we've been able to protect roughly 90% of the funding and know that what we put in that tier, we're going to get back. Well, that 90% is now 60%, which means that we're not competing against every other CoC for 10% of our funding. We're now competing against every other CoC for 40% of our funding. Which obviously we would rather not have to compete for 40%. So to be competitive with what we submit to HUD, we really need to look at the priorities that every agency on this call needs to be aware of those priorities. And when tailoring what you submit, be thinking about those priorities. We're the county and Jason and the CoC governing board is not going to dictate to you what you should submit to the CoC to be scored. You, the agencies that receive the funding, really have to dive into the NOFO and listen to this information session and think about how you want to tailor your application this year so that you get the highest scoring and that so you are the most competitive program. So it's probably not the best time in the world to have a huge transition in leadership at the top, but you play the hand you're dealt. And really for this process, it's dependent on you. It's dependent on you familiarizing yourself, like coming to this information session and really reading the NOFO carefully this year, and tailoring your proposals accordingly. So again, thank you. Thank you for coming to this information session. We'll record it. Feel free to share it. And also just thanks for the work that you do, because we know that the work that you do is hard and we do appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. I just want to acknowledge that several members of our CoC governing board are attending the information session, including our chair and vice chair, Ron Powers and Sharon Grasty, as well as the majority, if not all, of our collaborative applicant team in the Department of Human Services. And they are the real experts, so I hope they will join me in answering your questions later in the session. So I'm going to lead us through a PowerPoint-based discussion or slide deck-based discussion and highlight some of the key elements of this year's competition. I'd like to ask everyone to do two things. One is please introduce yourselves by name and organization in the chat, if you would. And also, if you have questions or comments as I'm making the presentation, please post those in the chat, and we will address all of those during the Q&A session. And we will start with Q&A around new projects and then follow that with Q&A around renewal projects. And if you are not a renewal project applicant, feel free to sign off at the end of the new project Q&A because the rest of the session will just be focused on discussion with our renewal grantees. So there are really several major elements we want to touch on today, starting with a foundational discussion briefly of what is the Continuum of Care program. What are the highlights and key changes in the FY 2026 NOFO? And then what are some important details related to our local competition here in Delaware County? And then there are several links that will be shared with this slide deck and posted online for more information. And then we will move to the Q&A. So, starting with the Continuum of Care program overview, this is a national program. It's established by law in the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. It's further codified by a CoC program interim rule and the Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition to Housing, or HARTH Act. The reason it's really important to understand that this is all based in federal statute is that there are elements of the competition, there are elements of how we're able to work locally on homeless crisis response that are restrictions that are not imposed by HUD and they're not imposed at the local level. They are part of what is dictated in these two congressional acts and also the interim rule. So I'll talk through some of those key elements, but that's sometimes where there's a kind of a challenge between our community understanding of homelessness, who is experiencing it, and eligibility for HUD-funded programs through the continuum of care. So that's all guided by congressional and federal law. The program is administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's typically administered through an annual grant competition, and that is the case this year. And HUD defines the continuum of care broadly as a community-wide commitment to the goal of ending homelessness that provides funding for efforts by nonprofits and others, and we'll talk about that, that promotes access to and effective utilization of mainstream programs, and that optimizes self-sufficiency among homeless individuals and families. And so how that is interpreted can change year by year based on what is part of the HUD annual grant competition for the program. So the way the program works is that every local continuum of care, of which ours, PA-502, is designated as Delaware County. Note that there are continuums of care in Pennsylvania that don't adhere to county boundaries. They are multiple counties sharing one continuum of care and one grant. That can create some additional challenges in terms of local coordination with local and county and municipal government, nonprofit service providers, partners in law enforcement and other public systems of care. So we're fortunate that our continuum of care boundaries align with our county so that we can more effectively work with those key partners, including funders, service providers, and community advocates. So every local continuum of care has to have what is called a collaborative applicant. That is really the lead organization applying for these CoC funds. The collaborative applicant for PA-502 is the Delaware County Department of Human Services. And that's why the staff team there is really responsible for overseeing this grant program. Within the application that we will submit as Delaware County Department of Human Services, which has several elements to it, we will also be submitting every project application that is submitted by an eligible organization. And so those applications actually get bundled together with our collaborative application, and the CoC governing board and the collaborative applicant are required to communicate to HUD what are the priority ranking of projects that they would like or we would like HUD to fund. And so that whole process is called the ranking and scoring process. And the priority listing is a part of that application that communicates what are, if HUD is going to prioritize projects to fund, what are the projects that we locally think will best meet unmet needs and fill gaps in the system. So who is eligible to submit project applications? Any configuration of government, state, county, city, township, special district government, any public or state-controlled institution of higher education, any Native American tribal government or organization, any public housing authority or Indian housing authority, and any 501c3 nonprofit organization. But please note that as part of the application, you must have a registration with SAM.gov, the Federal System Administration, and have a unique entity identifier number. So if a nonprofit does not have that number by the time they submit their application, HUD will not consider it for funding. HUD wants to clarify that faith-based organizations may apply on the same basis as any other eligible organization. And really, the entities that are not allowed to apply for a CoC grant are individuals and for-profit entities. Some of the requirements that start to restrict who can be served through projects in the CoC competition are projects that must serve one or more of the categories of homelessness as defined in the Hearth Act and as administered by HUD. So these are what many of us know are the HUD category 1 through 4 definitions of homelessness. Those definitions are explained in detail both on HUD Exchange, which is HUD's website, as well as in the CoC program interim rule and the Hearth Act. And those categories of homelessness have pretty tight definitions. And for grant-funded CoC providers, documentation that every client served, every participant, household, individual, or family meets the eligibility criteria and has the documentation to prove that as a condition of serving those households through a CoC funded program. So, category 1, literal homelessness, is the highest priority population for the CoC program, followed closely by, and in many cases, unfortunately, a household has experienced category 1 literal homelessness and category 4 fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, which does include a broader definition that includes domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and human trafficking. So, category 1 and 4 are the priority populations for most CoC funded projects. There is another category, imminent risk of homelessness, which essentially means a household is going to lose their housing in 14 days or less and does not have another permanent housing location or the resources to secure one. And that is category 2. And in this year's competition, there is a little bit more eligibility for new CoC funded projects to serve that category. But typically, that is also a restricted category for this program. And finally, there is category 3, homeless under other federal statutes, that pretty much applies to the educational system definition of homelessness, which is a different definition than the HUD definitions. And most CoCs around the country, including ours, are not allowed to serve category 3 in our CoC funded projects. So often when we talk about homelessness among school age children and youth in through 12. And we have data from our intermediate units and our school districts around families experiencing homelessness with school age students. They often would only qualify under Category 3, and CoC funded projects usually cannot serve Category 3. So that's where that disconnect sometimes occurs between HUD definitions and community definitions. CoC funded projects are almost always restricted to serving one or four, categories 1 and 4, as I said, and I'll show you later in the presentation what is eligible this year. So if you are a project applicant, it's very important to understand that you would only be able to serve participants who meet the categories of homelessness that are eligible for that project type in this year's competition. So, and a mantra for this entire discussion that Chris already alluded to is it's most important to read the NOFO carefully because there are details in the NOFO that we can't address today, and that we're still waiting, frankly, for HUD to offer some clarifying guidance on. We'll also say that there are DV bonus projects every competition that are restricted to exclusively serving households fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence and the rest of the Category 4 definition. So we'll talk about what all the project opportunities are in this particular FY26 NOFO, but that's overall how the continuum of care program functions. The other thing that prospective applicants need to know is that there are threshold criteria identified in the NOFO, and all applicants and their projects must meet every single threshold in order to be eligible in this competition. I will not go through all these, but you can read them in the NOFO. I do only want to highlight that there are two that are new, that are part of HUD's new priorities in its current administration, and that is that project applicants will not engage in illegal racial discrimination consistent with the requirements of 2 CFR 200, and that project applicants will not operate drug injection sites or safe consumption sites or knowingly permit the use or distribution of illicit drugs on property under their control. That refers primarily to harm reduction strategies, and we do not have clarification from HUD on exactly what is considered harm reduction in terms of, for example, is the distribution of Narcan considered harm reduction? We don't we don't think it is, but we don't have guidance from HUD confirming that. So every project applicant has to meet these threshold criteria. If we review locally submitted applications and they don't meet the threshold criteria, they will automatically be rejected. And that's not a local decision. That's because that's what is required in the NOFO. And then the last really piece of the puzzle for the continuum of care program overview is that while I'm about to show you how much funding is available nationally in this year's competition, any local CoC does not get to choose how much money they apply for. So we are on a fixed amount of funding that we are available to compete for every year in the competition. And there is a complex formula for HUD determining how much money that is. I will show you later that we anticipate it's around $6 million for Delaware County, but HUD has actually not issued the exact amount we are eligible for yet, even though the competition has already opened. So I won't go through this in super detail, but there is a calculation based on the CoC's geography, population, poverty rate, homelessness, previous homelessness data, all contributes to HUD calculating the amount we are eligible to apply for, as well as its whatever restrictions and amounts are dictated through Congressional Appropriations Acts and requirements. And so we're still actually waiting to find out exactly how much funding we can apply for, but we are expecting to receive our normal annual renewal demand and then a certain amount, perhaps up to 15% of that for new bonus projects. Some of those bonus projects will be restricted to DV only, and others can be any project type. Also, finally, every CoC receives a certain amount of money for planning every year. That planning grant is not competitive and it can't be shifted. It's a fixed amount that HUD provides, and that allows us to really operate the system, staff the system, manage the HMIS system, and other training opportunities and things like that. I'm going the wrong way. Apologies. Okay, so for the FY 2026 NOFO, if you're not aware, there are significant changes in the Notice of Funding Opportunity or NOFO for FY 2026. The last completed NOFO competition was FY 2024. At the end of December of 2025, HUD issued a annual NOFO, but it was rescinded after being blocked suspended, if you will, by the U.S. District Court of Rhode Island, based on a lawsuit brought by the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and multiple COCs around the country, challenging the NOFO's legality. So because of that, what HUD is doing instead, by court order, is simply funding the renewal of existing projects, and those, so our projects that were already operating through the CoC have been refunded for this year, or will be refunded for one more contract year. And now we're moving into the 2026 NOFO. So we are competing for project dollars that will be operationalized in 2027. And we are operating under a significant set of changes that I will talk through. So first of all, through congressional appropriation, there is $4 billion available in the FY 2026 competition nationally. HUD has placed some restrictions and set-asides on that funding, which is part of the reason that this year's competition is going to be more challenging. So there is at least 104 million set aside for new DV bonus projects. There is at least 430 million set aside for permanent housing projects for families with children. And there is up to 1.3 billion, which is again a significant part of this competition, set aside for new projects with a priority on transitional housing and supportive services only. I'm going to define what all of that means as we move through the presentation, but just for now, note, as Chris has already started to talk about, it's going to be a challenge to refund all our existing renewal projects because of the way HUD has structured some of these tierings and some of these restrictions. The HUD NOFO was released on June 1st, and it is due on August 26th. So it's a very short competition timeline, less than 3 months. And unfortunately, there are several important things that HUD has not issued yet, including the amount of funding we can apply for, including detailed instructions on how to complete the applications, and even the applications themselves have not yet been released. So all we're doing so far is planning the competition around the NOFO itself. I'd also like to note, and this is consistently true every year, that any applicant applying for a new or renewal project is required to prove and demonstrate and secure 25% match that does not come from HUD CoC funding. And the only exception is if it's a project that leases units for participants, instead of paying rental assistance for those participants, that leasing line item in the project budget is excluded from that 25% match. So if you are a new project applicant, note that part of the threshold requirement is to demonstrate in your application that that 25% of the total budget you're asking for can be matched with non-HUD CoC funds. The FY 26 NOFO has a set of 8 new priorities that have been defined by the new HUD administration, and those include improving outcomes that promote self-sufficiency with a revised definition of what self-sufficiency means, which I'll define later. creating competition to improve innovation and accountability, as will be demonstrated by the fact that 40% of our projects will be competing nationally with every other set of projects around the country in that 40%. What HUD defines as restoring balance to the continuum of care, which is a shift away from housing first and towards the reintroduction of other projects that have not been funded for the past decade plus. Prioritizing treatment and recovery services, and there are significant merit-based points in the competition for COCs and projects that can demonstrate access to behavioral health care and wraparound services. In some cases, there are requirements that not every COC can meet, and that means that not every COC is eligible for the full scoring points. But any projects that can demonstrate meaningful partnerships with behavioral health services and service providers, including mental health and substance use disorder recovery and treatment services, are going to be highly prioritized by HUD, and that means highly prioritized in our local competition as well. Promoting economic self-sufficiency, HUD is shifting away from um, system performance measures that include things like increasing access to public benefits or non-employment uh, income, and instead focusing more on participants exiting from programs with an increased level of earned income and employment, and is highlighting partnerships with workforce development, with employers and childcare providers as part of that. The sixth priority, advancing public safety for all. There is a significantly increased emphasis on collaborating with law enforcement, first responders, and other community partners in the criminal justice system. And as a COC, part of our consolidated application will be a narrative answers to questions around how we do partner with law enforcement and first responders at the local level. Seventh priority, minimizing trauma for vulnerable populations, particularly survivors of violence. And finally, expanding access based on merit. And that's really encouraging every eligible applicant to apply for funding. And we certainly do here in the PA-502 CoC. Which the competition is open to any nonprofit, faith-based organization, local government, or tribal organization that meets the applicant eligibility criteria. So, what are the projects that organizations can apply for in this competition? There are two types of projects. There are new projects that are not already operating with CoC funding in Delaware County, and there are renewal projects, which essentially means a currently funded continuum of care projects that are operating in Delaware County as part of our continuum of care funding. So new project types, when an organization submits an application for one or more new projects this year, um, the CoC can fund those projects that are ranked, scored, and accepted based on whether we can fund them through the new bonus project funding that HUD provides us, the new DV only bonus project funding that HUD provides us, or the reallocation of funding from existing CoC renewal projects. So reallocation is a responsibility of the CoC governing board, and HUD's priority is that over time, renewal projects that are either low performing are no longer meeting community needs or are underspending. And this year, HUD is being very clear that it's going to look very carefully at whether renewal projects are spending down their existing grants in a timely and complete manner. And HUD does reserve the right to reclaim funds from renewal grants that are unspent. And also it'll as a scoring criteria, renewal grant projects that are underspent or underperforming will be less likely to be awarded HUD renewal funding. So part of what the responsibility of the governing board in this competition is to identify projects for reallocation, and that could mean either eliminating those projects or simply reducing the size of those grants to match what is needed in the community and what the grantee is actually spending. When those funds are reallocated, that opens up new funding for more new projects. So even if we have a certain amount of funding for new bonus projects, we can add to that amount through reallocation. And then finally, there is a mechanism in the competition for new transition grants, and these grants are for renewal project recipients who voluntarily want to transition their grant from one project type to another, uh, specifically transition from a rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing project to a new transitional housing project. Um, Renewal project applicants that apply for a transition grant, they must be the applicant. They can't hand the renewal grant off to another recipient. They can't transition part of the grant. They have to transition the entire grant. And if the transition grant is awarded, the transition grant period will start the day after the current renewal contract expires. And actually, the recipient has 1 year to make that transition. So, when we talk later about the new transitional housing project grants, you'll see that not all people that are currently enrolled in a rapid rehousing or PSH project will be eligible to automatically move into a transition grant transitional housing project. Um, but there's a period of 1 year where those grantees can work with their current participants to try to exit them to permanent housing. In terms of renewal project grants, as I've discussed, all renewal project applicants are invited to apply for another year of renewal, but they are subject to reallocation. What kinds of new and renewal projects are acceptable in this year's competition, is what we're going to talk about next. And I'm going to highlight some of the changes in the FY 2026 NOFO so that new and renewal project applicants can start to think about where the projects you'd like to apply for might fit in terms of our local priorities and then HUD's priorities. The first eligible project component type is permanent housing. All of these are defined in greater detail in the NOFO and online at hudexchange.info, which is HUD's website. Permanent supportive housing is a type of long-term subsidy, housing subsidy, and wraparound case management services for people with significant disabling conditions that are barriers to self-sufficiency. Typically, people are enrolled in permanent supportive housing for several years, unless they are able to move on to something like a housing voucher uh, or self-sufficiency. And permanent supportive housing projects are often restricted to chronically homeless households, which is a HUD defined term, which has to do with a long-term history of homelessness and the adult head of household having a disabling condition. And many of the renewal projects in our CoC are restricted to those populations. Last month, HUD rescinded its notice of priority for permanent supportive housing projects, essentially deprioritizing the need to uh, prioritize chronically homeless households for PSH. And then adding to that flexibility in this new NOFO for the first time, new PSH projects can enroll people with disabilities who only meet the Category 2 definition of homelessness in addition to Category 1 and 4. So if a PSH renewal project or new project interests your organization, definitely read that section of the NOFO carefully. Rapid rehousing provides up to 24 months of rent subsidy and case management services before to help people exit back into the community with permanent housing stability and self-sufficiency. We have several rapid rehousing projects in our renewal continuum of care. But if you look at the way HUD has structured this year's competition, it's going to be very hard for current rapid rehousing projects to be refunded through this competition. So when we get to the renewal project Q&A, I'm sure we'll be talking about that in greater detail. But there is an opportunity for rapid rehousing projects to apply for a transition grant to transitional housing. And finally, there is a component of permanent housing called joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing. Those are projects in which, in the first part of the project, people can be exited from street homelessness or an institutional setting into short-term temporary housing and then get as they work to get enrolled into rapid rehousing with a lease in their name in the community. HUD in the FY26 NOFO, HUD will no longer accept new project applications for joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing, but renewal projects can apply for renewal, or again, they could apply for a transition to a pure transitional housing project. What is a pure transitional housing project? This is an eligible new project type in this year's competition that HUD has not allowed to be CoC funded for several years. Transitional housing, again, which is better defined in the NOFO itself, essentially provides up to 24 months uh, supportive or subsidized housing and supportive or wraparound services. But the difference between transitional housing and rapid rehousing is that in transitional housing, the participant does not have to be housed in a lease in their name. So they could be a subleasee or have an occupancy agreement with a transitional housing provider who either owns the housing themselves or is master leasing the housing from landlords and property managers in the community. The other major difference of transitional housing is that it has required supportive services for all program participants. So, as a condition of being enrolled in transitional housing and having up to 24 months of housing subsidized, um, participants must have at least 20 hours a week of mandatory supportive services that are either offered directly by the grant recipient or by a subrecipient. And then there are waivers if they are employed. There are waivers if they are 62 years or older, and there are waivers if they are handicapped. And I do mean that term specifically because that's what's in the NOFO, not just a disability, but a what is called handicap, which is a different part of the Code of Federal Regulations, or have a developmental disability. So there are a number of waivers to the 20 hours a week of supportive service requirements, but it does obligate the provider of the grant to staff those services or partner to staff those services and then work with every participant to ensure they are completing those services. That in rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, those services are optional for participants, and in transitional housing, they are required for participants. The next set of eligible projects that applicants can apply for are called supportive services only projects. In the last several years, we've only been able to apply for a coordinated entry project. Court entry is mandated by HUD, and it is really the front door into a local CoC crisis response system. It provides uniform, coordinated intake, assessment, prioritization, and referral to services. But starting this year, new project applicants can also apply for street outreach projects and for what are called standalone projects. So, street outreach is street outreach to people who are living unsheltered in the streets or other places not intended for human habitation. They do not provide people with housing, but they can provide people with supportive temporary services, and help them to move into housing through other CoC funded projects. I will say if you are intending to apply for a street outreach project, um, look at the NOFO scoring criteria for street outreach projects carefully because HUD's priority is street outreach that works with local law enforcement to move people out of encampments and to move people off the streets, particularly people experiencing mental health or substance use issues. Um, and then the other new kind of supportive service only project are called standalone projects as defined in the NOFO. They provide additional supports to people that are experiencing literal homelessness, but they cannot provide housing. So examples of standalone projects could be uh, day centers, projects that connect people with employment or childcare, but they are projects that cannot be used to provide any housing assistance to people experiencing literal homelessness. The other two project types are fairly restricted because one is Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS, which is also a HUD requirement, but it is really the HMIS lead agency that operates that HMIS. Any CoC funded project must manage all of its program and client information and reporting in the Delaware County HMIS. Just note that. And the final component, which we are now eligible to apply for in Delaware County, is homelessness prevention. There are only a few COCs around the country that HUD has allowed to use the grant funds for that purpose. The other thing I'd like to point out about transitional housing is if you are a nonprofit 501(c)(3) organization, by federal statute, you are not allowed to distribute rent assistance from a transitional housing project. You must partner with a legal entity that is allowed to distribute rent assistance, and that means a local housing authority or a unit of county or municipal government. So if you're interested in a new transitional housing project and you're a nonprofit, you have to identify a subrecipient in your application who can actually administer the rent assistance for you. The other condition around transitional housing for nonprofits is that if you own the property in which you are going to house participants, you cannot use the grant funds to pay for your own lease. So essentially, you can apply for a transitional housing grant for things like your operating expenses, your HMIS expenses, staffing costs, but you can supportive services, but not for the housing component of your project if you own or are already leasing space. It is possible that if you charge your transitional housing participants rent, which you're not required to do, you could have a subrecipient housing authority or unit of government that pays that rent, that subsidy directly to the client or the participant, but you cannot do so, or you cannot draw those leasing funds yourself. So, some other key elements of the 2026 NOFO. I mentioned a revised definition of self-sufficiency. HUD now defines self-sufficiency as the ability to meet basic needs, including a place to live, without public or private assistance. HUD has stated that the goal of the NOFO and its homeless assistant grant programs is to move people to self-sufficiency as quickly as possible. And that while existing renewal PSH and rapid rehousing projects are not required to start requiring their participants to have 20 hours a week of supportive services, HUD will score renewal projects higher that indicate they are going to implement requirements for supportive services. HUD also has a priority scoring for housing projects funded through the grant program that have on-site treatment services. Those on-site treatment services do not have to be delivered by grant recipient staff. They might be a subrecipient behavioral health provider, but they have to be services delivered on-site to get the full points. And as I've already mentioned, new SSO street outreach projects are really focused on reducing unsheltered homelessness, including encampments in partnership with law enforcement. I've talked through, I think, the key elements of transitional housing and the restrictions on that. But again, just to reiterate, what makes it different from rapid rehousing is that the participants can either have a lease, sublease, or occupancy agreement. And I also want to specify that that agreement or lease must be for a period of no shorter than 1 month and no longer than 24 months. So in terms of the competition, and this is one of the greatest challenges, Tier 1 is limited to 60% of our annual renewal demand, and that is decreased from 90% in previous competitions. What that means is there's no way to guarantee that we can refund all of our existing projects. And keep in mind that all of our existing projects are almost completely or completely full, meaning they are fully enrolled with participants. We're going to be forced to put some of those renewal projects in tier two. And then if you look at how HUD is scoring projects in tier two, renewal projects that go into tier two are essentially the least likely projects to get funded by HUD. So I'm gonna show you a little more about HUD specific competition scoring priorities. But if you are a renewal project recipient, please note that as you know, we will work with you as best we can, but it is very possible your renewal project will not get refunded by HUD. We do have the ability to place any project in what HUD calls tier one, that kind of quote unquote more guaranteed funding at 60% of our total grant amount, or tier two, where we're competing nationally. But technically, the governing board has the ability to put whatever projects that are eligible and that have applied into whichever tier it chooses. And in some cases, we might have to make certain decisions based on the strategy to maximize our scoring from HUD in order to get as much money into our system as possible. And also, for the first time this year, COCs can reallocate funding from any eligible renewal project, including projects that were brand new last time, and that's different. I'd also like to note that HUD has a completely revised set of scoring criteria for the COC itself, and that our projects are going to be funded partially based on how well we score in the merit review. And so this is where there are a total of 200 points available for us as an entire COC. You can see that the most points, over half of those, are questions around demonstrating our partnerships with other systems of care, including criminal justice, mental health, drug and alcohol, behavioral health, employment, and others. But those are very high priority. And then there are some bonus points available. The first one is irrelevant to us. The second one is a set of policy preferences, which have to actually be COC wide, so very hard to get, that have to do with delivering COC programs in opportunity zones, and advancing recovery by prohibiting illicit drug enablement. Those bonus points, just so you know, are not project level, those are COC level. So they're going to be hard for many COCs to get those bonus points. All of the details are mapped out in the NOFO if you're interested in seeing how this will work. If you are applying for a new project, these are the key scoring criteria that are going to be built into our local scoring tools. Every project that's submitted and meets the threshold criteria will then be scored through a scoring tool that we will be publishing next week. And our scores align with the HUD scoring criteria that are in the NOFO, and this is a summary of those. So you will see that while new transitional housing projects are pretty much HUD's highest priority for new projects, applicants must demonstrate that they have experience operating those projects, and that they have good outcomes. They don't have to be COC funded projects. They can be transitional housing funded by any source, but they will have to make the case that they have experience delivering transitional housing, and that they will require 20 hours of services per house, per participant per week, minus exemptions. And that's really the scoring criteria for those projects. The standalone, the street outreach, the core entry have additional criteria. Permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing have their own criteria, all of which is broken down in great detail in the NOFO itself. And in addition, even HMIS and planning grants have criteria, and we will be demonstrating in our COC application that we can meet the criteria for all of these projects. But that is part of how we will evaluate which projects will be selected for inclusion in our application. They have to meet the HUD scoring criteria, which means they have to score highly on our own local scoring tool. As Chris alluded to, we have a scoring committee. It's a project review committee comprised of non-conflicted members of the CoC governing board. They work with the team at Department of Human Services and myself to score all of the review all the project applications, score all the project applications, rank all of the accepted project applications, and then ultimately it's the non-conflicted members of the governing board that vote whether or not to approve those committee recommendations. And the last part of the NOFO competition that's important to highlight is this is the FY26 HUD conditional selection project uh, prioritization. So this is how HUD is going to select both nationally and locally the projects that they are going to fund in this year's competition. Starting with, they're going to fund all CoC planning grants that meet threshold requirements. As I said, those are non-competitive grants and those are fixed amounts that HUD determines. And then they are going to score all projects that are ranked in tier one that meet threshold requirements. And again, if we submit projects in tier one that are new, that are renewals, that are reallocations, that are DV bonus projects, they're going to go through every CoC's tier one projects, decide which ones they're going to fund, and that's going to start to reduce that $4 billion pool of funding before it gets to tier two. If they meet their set aside for DV bonus projects in tier one, um, they then have more freedom not to select DV bonus projects in tier two. But if they haven't funded the 104 million by the end of tier one selection, that will make it possible for more DV bonus projects to be awarded in tier two. They're then going to look at permanent housing projects for families with children that are ranked in tier one. And again, if they award $430 million worth of those, they're less likely to prioritize new PH projects or renewal PH projects for families that are in tier two. And then they're going to look at really the way they're going to look at tier two projects, the other 40% of our projects we're going to apply for, they are going to start with funding new transitional housing and supportive service projects until $1.3 billion of new projects have been selected. According to the National Alliance to End Homelessness and other national organizations that have calculated what this means, by the time they award 1.3 billion in tier 2, there will only be a few hundred thousand left to fund in tier 2, which means that every other kind of project in tier 2, which could be a new permanent housing project or a renewal permanent housing or coordinatory project, is frankly very unlikely to be funded. So this is why it's going to be important for every CoC governing board and ranking committee to prioritize new transitional housing and supportive service only projects in tier two, because it's very possible that's all that HUD is going to fund in tier two across the entire country. So that really, I think, drives home the importance of renewal project applicants in every CoC, particularly those that are PSH or rapid rehousing. Uh, be thinking about whether you might want to apply it for a transition grant to transitional housing instead. And last month, HUD issued some guidance on who is eligible to move from an enrollment in PSH or RRH to a new TH project and who is not. Unfortunately, because people enrolled in permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing are no longer defined as Cat 1 homeless, they are actually ineligible to be transferred into an agency or an organization's new transitional housing project, with a few exceptions, particularly for DV survivors. Um, and so there's a lot of complexity to planning for this year's competition, and unfortunately, in a very short period of time. So what we're doing locally in the PA-502 continuum of care for Delaware County is, again, in the last competition in 2024, we were awarded $6.3 million, primarily in renewal projects. We funded projects including PSH, RRH, joint THRH, coordinate entry, which is required, HMIS, which is required, and our planning grant, which is required. And now we're going to have to be thoughtful around what are the projects, new and renewal, that are most going to meet our local needs this and next year. So a little bit of data and more data is available upon request from the department staff. But just so you know, in our most recent annual point in time count in January of this year, 334 people in Delaware County were identified as experiencing literal homelessness. 285 of them were sheltered in our emergency shelter network, and 49 were unsheltered, living on the street or another place not intended for human habitation, which does suggest the need for additional funding for transitional housing and street outreach. And then looking at our HMIS system data between July 1st of last year and June 30th of this year, we had 340 unduplicated households enrolled in one of our CoC funded permanent housing projects and another 519 unduplicated households enrolled in our emergency shelter network. Because we are very unlikely to be able to have all of our permanent housing projects refunded, we are going to have to find some new opportunities or solutions for some of these enrolled households. And so, again, new transitional housing projects are a high priority for us, just as they are for HUD because of the restrictions in the NOFO. And some of the new project priorities that can address other system gaps locally, transitional housing projects for specific populations with different barriers to self-sufficiency, including DV survivors, seniors, reentry populations, people with physical and developmental disabilities, and people in recovery from substance use disorder. So I would just share as the CoC consultant that organizations could apply for a new project, for example, for transitional housing, and say we will serve any prioritized household. They'll have to identify whether they'll accept households that have these or other identifying conditions or circumstances. But I'm saying that because it's also possible to submit a project that is dedicated to one of these populations. So if your organization's expertise is working with seniors, even if you've not been a housing provider before, if you feel like you could submit and operate a competitive transitional housing program for seniors, that is something that the CoC is looking for and that HUD is looking for. And I'm not seeing I'm only seniors as just one example, any of these examples. So new projects can either serve all populations, some populations, or specific populations. And those applications should be tied to your organization's area of expertise and experience. We are also looking for additional projects for street outreach to expand our street outreach capability in Delaware County to work with unsheltered persons in partnership with law enforcement, first responders, hospitals, emergency shelters, and others. So we are accepting any eligible new project type, and we are going to make priorities based on the HUD competition, NOFO scoring, and our local needs. And we hope soon to know exactly how much we can apply for to HUD. Again, we do know that our ARD should be 6.1 million, and that according to the NOFO, HUD is going to allow us to compete for up to 15% of that ARD for new bonus projects. However, HUD has the right to use slightly different formulas, so that's why we're not making any calculations in this presentation. As soon as we know the exact amount, we will be posting that on our website, which I'll show you the link to in a bit. And we have not yet determined the amount that will be reallocated from renewal projects, but that again would create additional funding for new projects. Without those fixed guidelines, I know it can be a challenge to start developing a new project application, and frankly, without having the application itself to look at. But you can look at the NOFO for some guidance on that, and soon we will have those amounts. Our local competition timeline is as follows. Following today's information session, we will be posting our scoring tool online next week. We are going to be doing the entire application process from the HUD eSnaps system. That is the eSnaps grant portal that HUD requires us to use for the competition. So we are foregoing any interim steps. As soon as the application process is open in eSnaps, we will notify the community, and then eligible organizations can begin to build and submit their project grants, whether they're new or renewal or transition. Those applications are due in eSnaps July 17th. When you submit an application in eSnaps by July 17th, just so you know, it's not going to HUD yet. It's going to us as the collaborative applicant. We will then be taking all of the applications received by the due date, um, testing them for threshold requirements, scoring all of the ones that are accepted for the threshold requirements, and then ranking them and determining which ones will be accepted, rejected, and which renewal projects will be reallocated. And finally, what is the tier one and tier two ranking of all projects, new and renewal? That we will then notify applicants of their project acceptance, rejection, reallocation, and ranking August 11th. And we will also post that notice publicly on August 11th. We will post our consolidated application and priority listing of projects for public review by August 24th, and we will submit the application to HUD by the August 26th deadline. HUD has indicated again that they will announce the awards in December of 2026. So if you are developing a new project application, and as part of that, most likely in eSnaps, you'll have to show your startup timeline. Keep in mind that you probably won't receive, if you are accepted by us and awarded by HUD in December, you won't receive a contract to begin that project until sometime probably in the second quarter of 2027. So you're not starting the project the day the award is announced. You have to have a HUD contract first. Once you have a HUD contract, your relationship is with HUD. It's not through this, it's not mediated by the CoC unless the Department of Human Services is the applicant and you are a subrecipient. But if you're applying for a new project on your own, you will then enter into a contract with HUD. And the NOFO concludes the last section is a documentation of what you are agreeing to do post-award if you sign the HUD contract. So it's important to read that now to know what commitment you're making as a HUD CoC grantee. The last thing I'd note on this competition is stress that while the scoring tool is important and we will score every accepted project, the ranking of those projects by priority may be determined by other factors in addition to your project score, because we do have to think about what HUD is going to prioritize, particularly in tier two for new projects. So for more information, and then I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. There is a tremendous amount of additional information online. First and foremost, if you're not familiar with the Continuum of Care program, go to the HUD Exchange website. Also, a different part of that website, a different HUD website, their HUD Gov website, is where their competition page is, as they publish materials like detailed instructions on how to apply. Those will be posted on that second link. If you have questions about the NOFO, the best source of information is an email address called cocnofo@hud.gov. So if you're not sure whether you fully understand all of the requirements of a certain project type, it's really best not to contact us locally. It's best to submit to cocnofo@hud.gov. We can't fully interpret what is in the NOFO or what HUD is defining as all the details of the projects. And then if you are a new applicant and you're not familiar with the HUD eSnap system and you want to apply for a new project with us in this competition, you have to create a user profile and an organizational profile in HUD eSnaps. You can do that now. It's free. You just go to the link below. That way you'll be ready when the eSnaps applications open in the system. And if you have any questions or problems registering for eSnaps, using eSnaps, navigating eSnaps, there is a dedicated email address, e-snaps@hud.gov, that can answer your questions. These are additional links to information on some of the details of what we talked about, including the exact definitions and record keeping requirements for HUD categories 1 through 4 of homelessness. There is recent guidance on program participant eligibility to move from PSH or RAPID to a new transitional housing project. And recently, there's a really good answer to a CoC question on the HUD AAQ or Ask a Question webpage about the definition of imminent risk, which is that Category 2 definition of homelessness. Because there are projects in this NOFO that can technically serve Category 2, but there's a lot of granular detail about exactly who would qualify as Category 2, and that is explained in this specific answer. Locally, we can really only answer questions locally that are about our local needs and priorities and our local timeline and activities. But our overall website is delcohomelessservices.org. That's where you will find competition materials. And if you have local competition questions, please submit them to me by email. I will be sharing them with the Delaware County team. I won't be answering them all on my own. They'll definitely be answered by the collaborative applicant, but together we will address and answer as many of your questions as we can. So that concludes our information session for the FY 2026 NOFO. And now I'm going to stop the recording and I'm going